let's ease into our nuclear bedtime journey with a story that's equal parts terrifying and absurd. Picture this. It's the middle of the Cold War. Tensions are high, spies are busy, and someone thought it was a good idea to fly B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons over the US for practice missions. What could possibly go wrong? Well, how about accidentally dropping 2 live hydrogen bombs over North Carolina? That's what happened on January 24th, 1961, near the small farming town of Goldsboro. A B-52 bomber carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs experienced a structural failure mid-air. The plane broke apart and both nukes fell to Earth. And no, this isn't a James Bond movie plot. This actually happened. Each of those bombs was about 250 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Now here's the real kicker. One of the bombs deployed its parachute and landed gently in a field. The other slammed into the ground at high speed and buried itself deep into the muddy earth. But what matters isn't how they landed. It's how close one of them came to detonating. The bomb with the parachute went through 5 of its 6 arming steps. 5. It was one switch, literally a low-voltage trigger, away from vaporizing most of eastern North Carolina. A senior weapons engineer later said, "Only a single switch prevented a nuclear explosion." That's not exactly comforting, is it? The Air Force swooped in, cordoned off the area, and launched a massive cleanup operation. They recovered 1 bomb, mostly intact. The second, that's where things get weird. They couldn't find all of it. Part of the bomb, including a section of its uranium core, is still buried somewhere under a field near Goldsboro. The government bought the land and fenced it off. Problem solved, right? Kind of. The US government quietly declassified details of the incident decades later, but they didn't exactly broadcast it. After all, what's worse than dropping a nuclear bomb on your own country, dropping 2, and not being able to get one of them back? Let's pause here and just reflect on the idea that for years, local farmers were unknowingly plowing fields above a lost H-bomb. Imagine explaining that to your insurance agent. And the scariest part, this isn't even the only time it happened. The US military has lost over 30 nuclear weapons in various accidents, and not all of them were found. But more on that later. So next time you hear someone say, the government would never let something like that happen, you can gently whisper back, they already did. In North Carolina. Twice. Last time we talked about bombs falling where they shouldn't. This time, let's talk about bombs that officially don't exist, even though everyone agrees they definitely do. Welcome to the strangest open secret in global security, Israel's nuclear program. So here's the thing, Israel has never said, yes, we have nuclear weapons. But they've also never said, no, we don't. It's what we call a policy of ambiguity, and it's been in place since the 1960s. It's like someone showing up to a knife fight, wearing a lead-lined vest, and casually whistling, not saying anything, but making everyone very uncomfortable. The heart of this mystery is the Dimona Nuclear Research Center, located in the Negev Desert. From the outside, it looks like a sleepy scientific facility. But insiders, defectors, and a rather famous whistleblower named Mordecai Vanunu have painted a different picture, one involving underground labs, plutonium production, and enough warheads to make neighboring countries very nervous. Vanunu, by the way, was a former nuclear technician who blew the lid off the program in 1986. He gave a detailed interview to the Sunday Times in London, complete with photos from inside the facility. Shortly after that, Israeli agents lured him to Rome, kidnapped him, and whisked him back to Israel, where he spent 18 years in prison, much of it in solitary confinement. Subtle. But here's where it gets even more curious. The US government, particularly during the Kennedy and Johnson years, knew Israel was developing nuclear capabilities. How spy planes, diplomatic cables, the usual Cold War goodies. Yet rather than confront Israel openly, the US quietly agreed to look the other way. Why? Because publicly acknowledging Israel's nukes would have triggered all kinds of diplomatic dominoes, especially with US allies and international non-proliferation agreements. Instead, Washington and Tel Aviv developed a mutual understanding. Don't ask, don't tell, but definitely don't test. That's right. To this day, Israel has never officially conducted a nuclear test. Not above ground, not underground. Nothing that anyone can prove, at least. There was a suspicious flash of light detected over the Indian Ocean in 1979, known as the Vola incident. But both the US and Israel shrugged and said, must have been a meteor. Sure, a meteor with a mushroom cloud. Unofficial estimates suggest Israel may have up to 80 to 200 nuclear warheads. That's not a typo. 200. But unlike most other nuclear-armed countries, Israel hasn't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT), which would require them to disclose and regulate those weapons. Their logic? If they never admit to having nukes, they don't have to admit they're breaking any rules. And that strategy has worked remarkably well. It gives Israel strategic deterrence, especially in a region where enemies outnumber friends without the international drama of, say, North Korea or Iran. It's a quiet kind of power, the kind that doesn't need parades or tests, just a long silence and a slightly raised eyebrow. But it also raises deep questions about the transparency, accountability, and nuclear double standards. Why can some countries get away with ambiguity while others get slapped with sanctions? And what happens if the world finally stops playing along? For now, the silence continues. Dimona keeps humming. And Israel's nuclear arsenal remains the world's worst-kept secret. We've covered bombs that were lost and bombs that are whispered about. Now, let's talk about the time someone said, "Hey, what if we used nuclear weapons to dig holes?" Yes, that was a real idea. And it had a name that sounds like it came from a hippie farmer's dream journal, Project Plowshare. Started in 1957 by the US Atomic Energy Commission, Plowshare was pitched as a peaceful use of nuclear explosions. The logic went like this. If these things can destroy entire cities, surely they can also build stuff. Brilliant. Need a canal? Nuke it. Want to mine natural gas? Nuke it. Thinking about carving a new harbor in Alaska? You guessed it, nuke it. At one point, scientists actually proposed using over 20 nuclear bombs to dig a shortcut from California to the Gulf of Mexico, like a Pan-American Canal, but with significantly more radiation. And fewer boats afterward. But the real test cases were even weirder. Let's start with the Sedan crater, which sounds like the world's saddest car accident, but is actually the result of a 1 on 4 kiloton blast in Nevada. In 1962, they detonated a nuke underground just to see what kind of hole it would make. Spoiler, it made a very big one, over 200 feet wide and 300 feet deep. So far so cratery. But then came the radiation. The blast kicked up about 12 million tons of radioactive soil into the atmosphere. Wind carried that lovely dust cloud across several US states. People were told it was minimal, but tests later showed measurable contamination in milk supplies. Yum! Undeterred, the government tried nuclear fracking. Yes, nuclear fracking to extract natural gas. This led to a series of tests with names like Gas Buggy Rulison and Rio Blanco. These sound like indie rock bands, but they were all underground nuclear explosions. And guess what? It did release natural gas. It just made it completely unusable because it was radioactive. Imagine turning on your stove and cooking dinner with plutonium-scented gas. It's not exactly something you want in your fajitas. The worst part. The radioactive material didn't stay put. It lingered in the ground, in the water, in the air. And because nuclear isotopes are notoriously clingy, they stuck around for decades. Eventually, even the most enthusiastic atomic optimists had to admit nuking the planet to improve. It wasn't a genius idea after all. By the late 1970s, Project Plowshare had spent around $770 million and produced exactly 0 useful public works, unless you count radioactive craters as tourist attractions. And yes, some people do. You can still visit the Sedan crater if you're into that sort of thing. Just don't lick anything. Plowshare was quietly buried, not with a bang, but with a red-faced shrug. And the idea of peaceful nukes went the way of disco Cold War optimism and using asbestos as insulation. So next time someone says, there are no bad ideas, feel free to remind them that the US once tried using nuclear bombs as a shovel. All right, buckle in. Because if you thought lost bombs and crater-building nukes were scary, wait until you meet the Soviet Union's ultimate just-in-case system, a real-life doomsday machine with a name straight out of a Cold War horror novel, Dead Hand. Yes, that's what they called it. Not Operation Peacekeeper or Strategic Echo. No, Dead Hand. Subtle. Also known by its more technical name, Perimeter. This was a semi-automated nuclear response system designed to ensure one thing. If the Soviet leadership was wiped out in a surprise nuclear strike, their missiles would still fly. No orders, no passwords. Just one last terrifying goodbye to the rest of the planet. Let's break this down. Dead Hand wasn't about launching the first strike. It was about responding to one, even if no humans were left to push buttons. Because in the 1980s, the fear was real. What if the Americans pulled a fast one, nuked Moscow, and left the USSR unable to retaliate? The answer: build a system that watches everything. Radio signals, seismic activity, radiation levels, command communications. And if it detects that everyone's dead or unable to respond, it launches a full-scale counterstrike on its own. You know, just in case we weren't already anxious enough during the Cold War. The way it worked was almost elegant in its horror. After a detected attack, if all lines of command were silent, a special missile would be launched, not at an enemy, but into the air to broadcast launch orders to other silo submarines and mobile platforms across the Soviet Union, like a grim version of a group text, but with thermonuclear consequences. And here's the creepiest part. Dead Hand still exists. Maybe not in its original 1980s form. Maybe updated. Maybe dusty in a bunker somewhere. But Russian officials have confirmed vaguely that a version of Perimeter is still operational today, just in case someone gets any ideas. This raises so many questions. Who monitors it? How fast does it react? And how do we know it won't misinterpret, say, an earthquake or a power outage, as the end is nigh? Naturally, no one's giving straight answers, because surprise doomsday machines are not the kind of thing governments like to put in brochures. The US, by the way, never built an equivalent. We always relied on human decision-making red phones and guys in bunkers with very sweaty palms. But the Soviets didn't want to leave their fate to chance or emotion. So they trusted the one thing that's always calm, cold, and totally free of empathy: a machine. Now think about that. A computer designed to end the world in case humanity was already gone. It's the nuclear version of a spiteful ex mailing all your embarrassing photos after the breakup. Only instead of photos, it's missiles. Hundreds of them. It's a chilling reminder that during the Cold War, the goal wasn't just we win. It was, if we go down, we all go down. And in a strange way, it worked. Dead Hand was so terrifying that it may have helped prevent war, a macabre kind of peace through guaranteed mutual destruction. Still, as we tuck ourselves into night, here's a gentle bedtime thought. Somewhere, possibly right now, a machine is listening, waiting, just in case the worst happens, to make sure the rest happens too. Sweet dreams. All right, sleepy traveler. Let's dive underwater for this one. Because it turns out that nukes don't just fall from the sky. Sometimes they sink. And unlike your car keys or a dropped snack, when a nuclear weapon goes missing in the ocean, it tends to stay missing. They even have a name for these broken arrows. Sounds kind of poetic, right? Until you realize it means nuclear weapons accidents. The US alone has reported over 30 of them, and a surprising number involve the ocean saying, "Thanks, I'll take that." Let's start with 1968, a year that must have really tested naval insurance agents. 4. Yes. 4 nuclear submarines from different countries vanished in the same year. One of them was the USS Scorpion, an American nuclear sub with 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes on board. It sank in the Atlantic with 99 crew members, because still officially unknown. The wreck was found later deep beneath the ocean, and the warheads, yep, still down there. Not a lot of swim-up recovery options for that kind of thing. But that's just the appetizer. Back in 1966, a US B-52 bomber collided midair with a refueling plane off the coast of Spain near a town called Palomares. 4 hydrogen bombs fell. 3 were recovered on land. The 4th plunged into the Mediterranean. Cue full-scale underwater search operation. The US Navy sent in deep-sea submersibles, sonar teams, and probably more nervous sweating than the ocean's seen since the Kraken retired. It took nearly 3 months to find and recover the missing bomb from a depth of nearly 2,500 feet. Meanwhile, locals were reassured everything was fine, even as radioactive dust was quietly cleaned up from nearby tomato farms. Hmm, mutant marinara. But it gets weirder. In 1958, a B-47 bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb off the coast of Savannah, Georgia. It didn't detonate, thankfully, but the Air Force never found it. That's right. There's still a live nuclear bomb somewhere near Tybee Island. Locals call it the Tybee bomb. Some treat it like a legend. Others just try not to think about it while paddleboarding. Now you might be wondering if they know these bombs are out there. Why don't they go get them? Well, short answer. It's really, really hard. Long answer, sometimes they try. But the ocean is big. Nuclear bombs are small-ish, and decades of sediment currents and political embarrassment tend to bury things quickly, literally and diplomatically. To be fair, not every lost warhead poses an immediate threat. Most are either too deep to reach or missing key components for detonation. But that doesn't mean they're safe. Corrosion happens, materials leak, and sea creatures are not trained in radiation safety. It also makes you wonder how many missing nukes are there that we don't know about. Official numbers are one thing, but the word classified tends to pop up a lot in conversations about misplaced weapons of mass destruction. So as you drift off tonight, just remember, somewhere beneath the waves, in forgotten trenches and silent seabeds, there are bombs sleeping too, hopefully forever. So far we've talked about lost bombs, silent arsenals, and machines designed to end the world in your absence. But now, let's pivot to something stranger. Because there's only one country in history that has built nuclear weapons and then voluntarily dismantled them. Cue the dramatic spotlight on South Africa. During the height of apartheid, while the world was focused on racial tensions and international sanctions, South Africa was secretly building something else behind closed blast doors, a full-on nuclear weapons program. And not just dabbling, they built 6 fully functional nuclear bombs, with a 7th almost finished. These weren't science fair models. These were war-ready devices, developed with the help of uranium mined from their own soil. Why the short version fear? In the 1970s and 1980s, South Africa felt isolated, surrounded by hostile neighbors, increasingly cut off by international sanctions, and paranoid about Soviet influence in the region. The ruling apartheid government decided that nukes would be the ultimate insurance policy. And here's the plot twist. They never tested one. Well, at least not officially. In 1979, an American satellite known as Vela detected a mysterious double flash of light over the South Atlantic. You know the kind of flash you get when a nuclear bomb goes off. The US investigated. The conclusion, inconclusive. Sure, just like that glowing thing in the sky was inconclusive to dinosaurs. Many believe the 1979 Vela incident was a joint nuclear test between South Africa and Israel. Remember those guys with the secret nukes? But to this day, both nations deny it ever happened. Because denial is the most powerful energy source on Earth. Now fast forward to the early 1990s. Apartheid was crumbling. Nelson Mandela was on the verge of being released. And the South African government looked at their nuclear stockpile and thought, maybe it's not a great idea to hand these over to a democratic government that might not want to keep our secrets. So they dismantled everything. By the time Mandela took office in 1994, The nukes were gone, dismantled, blueprints shredded, facilities decommissioned. It was the nuclear version of cleaning the house before the guests arrive, except instead of dirty dishes, it was 6 weapons of mass destruction. And yes, South Africa did open up to international inspectors afterward. The IAEA, that's the UN's nuclear watchdog, confirmed the bombs were gone. A clean break, they said, but here's where it gets suspicious. Some experts argue the documentation was too clean, that certain records were missing, that key personnel vanished, that maybe, just maybe not everything was handed over. Could 1 or 2 nukes have been hidden, smuggled, sold? We don't know. Officially, the story ends with disarmament and hugs. But in a world where secret programs lost bombs and geopolitical chess are the norm, it's not hard to imagine a few puzzle pieces missing. The idea that only South Africa built and gave up nukes is impressive and maybe a little naive. It's comforting to believe and unsettling to question, because when you've built the most powerful weapon on Earth, walking away from it is harder than it sounds. And maybe someone didn't. We've seen nukes fall, vanish, and quietly retire. But what happens when countries that aren't supposed to have nuclear weapons start getting help from countries that already do? Behind closed doors, of course. Welcome to the radioactive soap opera of the Middle East in the 1980s, where enemies traded arms, allies looked the other way, and nuclear programs popped up like suspicious mushrooms after a storm. Let's start with Iran pre-1979, when it was still run by the US-friendly Shah. Back then, Iran was the golden student of Western nuclear ambition. They got American help, German reactors, and even glowing thumbs up from the IAEA. The plan was peaceful power, but the infrastructure, oh, it could be flipped. Then came the Iranian Revolution, and suddenly, things weren't so friendly anymore. The US went from, let's build reactors together, to, wait, you want enriched uranium now? Dope. Sanctions followed. So did paranoia. And while the world scolded Iran, Iraq, run by the mustachioed enigma, Saddam Hussein, was cooking up its own secret sauce. He said it was for energy. Western governments nodded. France sold them a nuclear reactor. Italy sold equipment. The US sold, well, let's just say there were meetings. And then, in 1981, Israel bombed Iraq's Osirak reactor in a preemptive airstrike. It was a loud, fiery way of saying no nukes for Saddam. The world gasped. Israel shrugged. Iraq fumed and doubled down on secrecy. Now, let's not pretend it was all DIY. Both Iran and Iraq had help from scientists, from companies, from governments who maybe didn't ask too many questions if the payment cleared. Some experts believe Pakistan, which had its own secret nuclear program thanks to A.Q. Khan and a talent for nuclear networking, may have shared designs. North Korea's name also comes up. So does China's and Russia's. Basically, if you had blueprints and a briefcase, someone wanted to talk. Here's the twist. During the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, while both sides were dreaming of radioactive leverage, the US quietly supported Iraq, even as it knew about chemical weapons use and possible nuclear ambitions. Why? Because Iran had just taken American hostages. Geopolitics is messy like that. And guess who else got nervous? The Saudis. Rumors swirled that Saudi Arabia might be bankrolling nuclear programs in Pakistan just in case things in the region went full Mad Max. And the UAE, let's just say there were phone calls, lots of them. Then in the 1990s, Saddam's nuclear dream hit a brick wall after the Gulf War. Inspectors went in, documents came out, and the world learned just how close Iraq had gotten. As for Iran, its nuclear story didn't end in the 80s. In fact, it's still going. Enrichment inspections, secret facilities, assassinations, diplomacy, and a constant ping-pong game of trust us, and we'd rather not. Here's the quiet truth. No one likes to say out loud. Nuclear ambition in the Middle East hasn't just been about national pride or self-defense. It's been about leverage. The kind of leverage that gets you a seat at the big table, or at least keeps you from being thrown off it. And while the West plays referee, sometimes holding back, sometimes selling parts under the table, the region watches, learns, plans. Because when your neighbors might have the bomb, the idea of restraint gets a little radioactive. Let's take a break from missiles and mushroom clouds and follow the money. Because if there's one thing nuclear weapons need, besides uranium and paranoia, it's cash, a lot of it. And what better place to quietly move large sums of mysterious origin than through a bank with no transparency, no audits, and a moral shield made of centuries-old stone. Welcome to the Vatican Bank, also known by its much fancier name, the Institute for the Works of Religion. Sounds like a prayer group, right? Not quite. Between the 1970s and 1990s, this holy institution was at the epicenter of some of the least holy financial scandals in modern history. Now, we already know the Vatican has had its hands full with missing money and suspicious investments. But here's the twist. Some of those financial pathways may have intersected with nuclear weapons programs. Stick with me. Let's start with the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, the world's most polite, well-dressed criminal organization, disguised as a global bank. It handled money for dictators' arms, dealers, drug cartels, and intelligence agencies. And guess what? It had quiet, cozy ties to Vatican-connected banks. BCCI was like the financial equivalent of a nuclear waste barrel. Looks boring on the outside, highly dangerous on the inside. During the 1980s, it funneled money to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, some of which investigators believe funded Iraq's nuclear ambitions. And those funds, some of them passed through overlapping channels that also involved entities linked to the Vatican Bank. See the spaghetti forming? Here's one sauce-splattered noodle, Banca Nazionale del Lavoro, BNL, an Italian bank partly tied to both BCCI and Vatican-related accounts. BNL made billions of dollars in secret loans to Iraq, quietly and illegally, right before the Gulf War. And the money flowed through Luxembourg, Panama, and the Bahamas. Basically every place where the sun shines and the laws don't. And remember our old friend, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the former Pope's bodyguard turned Vatican banker with linebacker shoulders. He was at the center of several of these scandals, including one involving mafia money, shell companies, and Banco Ambrosiano. That's 3 banks, 1 priest, and a nuclear-ambitious regime, all sharing spreadsheets. Cozy. Now, did the Vatican knowingly support nuclear proliferation? Probably not. Did they knowingly avoid asking questions about where the money was going, who was moving it, or why certain accounts were under fake names? Oh, definitely. See, the beauty of a religious bank is plausible deniability. You're funding a charity great, a missionary project in the Middle East lovely. Just don't mention that the missionary might be carrying centrifuge parts in his suitcase. The Vatican's financial system was and still is cloaked in secrecy. It doesn't report to outside regulators. It answers only to the Pope. And for decades, that made it the perfect spiritual laundromat for bad actors who didn't want receipts. Now imagine you're a regime under sanctions with scientists in labs and a nuclear program on the wish list. How do you pay for it? Not in bags of cash from under your mattress. You use the system, the shadow network, the quiet banks that don't blink. And sometimes that trail leads through the world's smallest country with the world's biggest vault of untold secrets. So the next time you see a priest counting rosary beads, just remember, behind those walls, behind the marble and incense, might be the faint scent of plutonium and paperwork. We've talked about bombs, in the air bombs, under the sea, and bombs that might be hiding in churches. But nuclear danger doesn't always come from weapons. Sometimes it comes from the power plants we build ourselves. Enter Fukushima. It was March 11th, 2011. A magnitude 9.2 earthquake hit off the coast of Japan. Minutes later, a tsunami slammed into the coast, crushing downs flooding streets and sweeping away lives. And right in its path was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, a facility that was supposedly designed to handle nature's worst. Spoiler, it wasn't. 3 of the plant's 6 reactors went into full meltdown. Hydrogen explosions ripped through the outer buildings. Radioactive steam and contaminated water began pouring into the environment. And Japan, one of the most advanced nations on Earth, was suddenly in full crisis mode without a clear script. Now here's where things get fuzzy. In the early days, the Japanese government and the plant's operator, TEPCO, made repeated statements that everything was under control, which was technically true if your definition of control includes radiation levels, spiking emergency crews evacuating, and no one actually knowing how bad things really were. The real kicker: the meltdown had already begun before anyone admitted it. Internal documents and later investigations revealed that officials knew reactors were failing, but delayed announcements to avoid panic. Mission accomplished. Until panic happened anyway. So what about the radioactive release? How bad was it, really? Well, estimates suggest Fukushima released roughly 10–20% of the radioactive material that Chernobyl did. Not as catastrophic, but still plenty alarming, especially since much of it leaked into the Pacific Ocean, where it mixed with water currents and went on a world tour. At the time, governments downplayed it, diluted, minimal impact, safe for consumption. Yet testing in the years following showed detectable levels of radioactive isotopes in fish seaweed and even California wine. Yes, wine. 2011 vintage with a hint of cesium. And then there's the cleanup. Over a decade later, Japan is still storing over 1 million tons of radioactive water in giant steel tanks. Space is running out. And their plan: slowly release it into the ocean. Filtered, they say, and safe. Naturally, local fishermen, environmental groups, and neighboring countries like South Korea and China are not thrilled. But wait, it gets murkier. Investigations revealed that TEPCO had been warned years earlier about the tsunami risk and ignored it. Why? Because raising the seawall or redesigning backup systems would have been expensive. So instead, they crossed their fingers. That's the uncomfortable truth of Fukushima. Not just a natural disaster, but a human failure of design, regulation, and communication. And yet, even as radiation maps lit up and robotic cameras descended into molten cores, most of the world just moved on. There were statements, some protests, and then silence. No heads rolled, no international reckoning. Just lessons quietly swept under the cooling pools. Even the Japanese government, once panicked, began pushing nuclear power again just years later, quietly, carefully, and with renewed branding. Because energy security, especially in an island nation, doesn't come easy. So what's the real legacy of Fukushima? It's not just radioactive fish or glowing headlines. It's the reminder that nuclear technology, no matter how peaceful, always carries a price. And sometimes that price is paid not in one explosion, but in years of silent secrecy and contaminated soil. And if you think the world learned its lesson, well, that depends on who's writing the report. Okay, deep breath. We've gone from falling bombs to missing warheads, secret bank trails to reactors melting by the sea. But now for our final stop, let's talk about something a little more abstract, but no less terrifying: the times we almost ended the world and didn't. Not because of brilliance, not because of diplomacy, but because of luck. Welcome to the chilling world of nuclear near. This is a set of events so hair-raising they sound like fiction. Only they're real. They happened. And many of them were kept secret for years, quietly buried in declassified documents, forgotten briefings, and oops files filed far from public eyes. Let's start with 1983. The Cold War is still ice-cold. Tensions between the US and the Soviet Union are high, and NATO is running war games called Able Archer. Now to us, that sounds like a silly training exercise. But to the Soviets, it looked exactly like a real nuclear attack. Soviet radar officers were so convinced that missiles were incoming, they began preparing to launch their own. One man, Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet lieutenant colonel, got an alert that 5 US missiles were on their way. His screen was lighting up. Protocol said, "Alert command. Let the retaliation begin." But Petrov hesitated. He decided it must be a glitch. His reasoning: if this were real, it wouldn't be just 5 missiles. So he did nothing. And by doing nothing, he may have saved the world. No medals, no ceremonies, just a sigh, and a global bullet dodged. But that's not the only one. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine named B-59 was floating near US ships. American forces began dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. Inside, the sub-officers, with nuclear torpedoes and permission to use them if all 3 senior officers agreed. 2 said yes. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. Again, one man, one decision. No mushroom cloud. Then there's NORAD, in 1979, where a technician inserted the wrong tape into a computer system. It triggered a simulated full-scale Soviet attack, which wasn't real. But the system didn't know that. Jets were scrambled, bombers prepped, and the world teetered on the brink of chaos because someone somewhere pressed play on the wrong reel. And it happened again in 1980, this time because of a faulty 0.46 chip. Yes, the cost of almost ending the world was less than a chocolate bar. These stories and many more like them were hidden because they made everyone look fallible, flawed, human. And when your job is maintaining the illusion of perfect control over thousands of apocalyptic fireballs, admitting that your biggest enemy might be a sleepy radar tech or a confused computer. Yeah, not great PR. Governments kept these incidents secret for decades. Some are still classified. And while the Cold War may feel like ancient history, the reality is near misses still happen. Cyber attacks, satellite glitches, rogue launches, miscommunication. All it takes is one false signal, one overreaction, one missed coffee break, and poof. What's wild is that we live in a world where a button press could end civilization, and yet most people worry more about their phone battery dying. We've come close, closer than we ever knew. And the reason we're still here, often it wasn't wisdom. It was a gut instinct, a lucky delay, or just nothing happening when it could have, which might be the scariest truth of all. So here we are. At the end of our nuclear journey, 10 secrets, 10 shadows, 10 quiet truths that governments have buried, misfiled, or wrapped in official statements that say a lot without saying anything. We've wandered through deserts where bombs were tested, floated above oceans hiding lost warheads, peered into vaults of sacred banks and into the still glowing rooms of failed reactors. And we've learned, perhaps uncomfortably, that the world has come closer to the edge than most of us ever knew. But as we slow down now, as the lights dim and the headlines fade, remember this: power always leaves footprints. Even if they're swept away, they're still there. In files stamped classified. In bombs buried beneath fields. In the quiet hum of a machine waiting for a signal that we hope never comes. And yet somehow, the world keeps turning. People fall in love. Babies are born. Dogs bark at the mailman. Nations may build weapons that could end everything, but life stubbornly goes on. So as you lay your head down tonight, drifting into that soft space between thought and dream, don't carry fear. Carry awareness, curiosity, maybe even a strange kind of gratitude for the people who didn't press the button, who told the truth in whispers, who hesitated when it mattered most. History is full of dark corners, but sometimes, when you shine just a little light, you find a story that makes you pause and breathe. And maybe that's the secret after all. Not what governments are hiding, but how often we survive despite them. Sleep well. The bombs are quiet for now,